All right, as we come to the book of Judges again, we come to the second major interpretive issue, and that is the chronological conundrum that comes about when you read through the book of Judges, and then also tie that in with the first 7 chapters of the book of Samuel, that all is leading up to the establishment of the monarchy within Israel. And when we get to Kings, we'll talk about how biblical chronologists have taken the material that is in Samuel and Kings and how they have aligned it with the Assyrian Epimene lists, and believe that from the 10th century BC through the rest of the Old Testament history, culminating in the Babylonian captivity, that they can come in that first millennium BC and be within just a number of years as far as basic biblical chronology is concerned. So really from the divided kingdom on, the debate is usually within a decade as far as dating is concerned, from the most moderately liberal men who see a modicum of truth within the Kings and Chronicles records that are given to us, and the most orthodox evangelical biblical inherentist that looks at the biblical material as well. So that when we think in terms of the arising of the monarchy and the coming forth of Saul, I mean, we're within a decade either way. It's kind of like, the contemporary pollsters, that here is a number is within a certain range of era. Well, it's the same thing with biblical chronologists. Once you get to Saul, that within about a 20 to 25 year period with Saul, and then it just narrows down the closer you get to the Babylonian captivity, that within these basic constraints that are very, very narrow compared to what we've talked about in the second and third millennium BC, that it's like in the third and second millennium BC, we're talking, within centuries. Can we accurately state the chronology? By the time we get into the first millennium BC, we're within a decade either way. And certainly by the time we get into the captivity and post-exilic period, we're into just, a year or two either way, as far as our chronology is concerned. Well, Judges is right within the transition from at the beginning of Judges, where we're, still arguing about what century it is in, to the end of the period of the Judges, when now the debate becomes, all right, what is the decade in which we are speaking? So broadly speaking, the period of the Judges, and I've given you a chart and giving you the problem, and that is on the most conservative dating. We only have approximately 325 years for the period of the Judges. You take a later date for the Exodus and conquest, as most liberals and a growing number of evangelicals do, and this period is even shortened beyond that. You put the conquest at about 1230 BC. You put it back almost 200 years, and all of a sudden you're not talking about 325 years. You're talking somewhere around 150 years for the period of the Judges. All right, so what is the problem? Well, the problem is, and here is the data from the period of the Judges. Judges itself talks about the fact that God raised up a judge after a certain time period of oppression. And we realize that these years could be inclusive, that we're not necessarily saying on January 1st of this year, 8 years began that ended on December 31st, and then on January 1st, God raised up the judge, the victory is won, and now he, has rest. The land has rest for 40 years. In other words, we realize the basic inclusive nature of the fact that the part of a year would be considered to be a year, but you take a look at the oppressions and the years of rest, you're still dealing with approximately 395 years, even if a year really was only a day in certain cases. I mean, if you could go that far, which we can't. But just going through the Judges, and I've listed there for you the chart. When Judges makes a statement of, this is how many years they were oppressed by this people, God raised up this judge, okay, the oppressor was defeated, and then the land had rest for X amount of years. Well, if you add that all together, just the amount that we have, it comes up. Kaiser says 409 years. I don't know what calculator he used, but as I went through, it adds up to 410 years. What's a year between friends at that point? You see, he's taking that inclusive reckoning and saying, all right, well, they weren't all full years, so I'll just knock a year off and get to about 409 years. But nevertheless, all right, you add it up, you got 410 years. Then you've also got, as you get into the early chapters of Samuel, you've got at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 4 that we're told about Eli. Eli not only was the high priest, but he also judged Israel. And we are told in verse 18 of 1 Samuel 4, thus he judged Israel 40 years. So we've got another judgeship of 40 years. Now, nothing is said about Eli being raised up to deliver Israel, but the fact that he judged, that he was a man whom God raised up to, as we saw last time, give leadership to Israel is seen. And then when we get to Samuel, and we find out that Samuel also judged, and we're told in 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 15, now Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. All right, well, how long is that? Well, we find out concerning the ark, the ark that was taken to Kiriath Jearim, that in 7:2 that it was 20 years. The ark remained at Kiriath Jearim. That the time was long, for it was 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after Yahweh. It seems to be that as you read the capture of the ark, and then the ark coming back, and the men of Beth-Aven, Beth-Shemesh, dying and passing it on to Kiriath Jearim, and then it's left there 20 years. And it seems to be that it was there for 20 years after the death of Eli, at least, until Samuel is raised up by the Lord, first as a prophet, and then he leads Israel in repentance that leads to their victory over the Philistines. And then he judges after that, and we're not told chronologically how long he judged Israel. So that's a question mark, but it seems as though the oppression of the Philistines after the death of Eli was at least another 20 years based on 2 Samuel chapter 7. And then we have some unknown years that have to be added, so that there's at least 60 plus years added from what is seen in 1 Samuel to this whole era of the judges that begins with the death of Joshua and the elders who succeed him, who were elders with him until they finally die. And then we get into the oppressions and the judges that God raises up. So here is the problem. All right, we have these approximately 470 years at least for the period of the judges, and basically that doesn't fit into anybody's chronology, biblically, and certainly if we take 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 literally as we have done, than the Bible itself says. You know, from the 4th year of Solomon going back to the Exodus is 480 years. Right? And we've just said that you add up all these years, you got 470 plus years just for the period of the Judges. You got to have the wilderness, you got to have the 40 years in the wilderness, you've got to have the conquest and Joshua's generation dying, you got to have Saul, you got to have David to get to the 4th year of Solomon. And it's very, very clear that David reigns for 7 years in Judah, 33 and a half years over the rest of Israel, so approximately a 40-and-a-half-year reign. We've got Saul. There's a big question mark exactly how long his reign was, but if we take Acts chapter 13, Paul, as he preaches, says that was another 40 years to add. In other words, you add all the biblical chronology. We're not talking about extra biblical data here. You just add what the Bible is saying about this time period and try to fit it into 480 years, and it doesn't fit. And of course, those of us who believe in biblical inerrancy, very, very quickly we are confronted by those who don't and say, how do you explain that one? The Bible itself, seems to lead to contradictory evidence at this point. So what is the answer? Well, as we read Judges carefully, Judges seems to indicate that there were overlapping judgeships. Go back to the chart, and one of the very interesting things that you note is the tribal diversity that is seen within the judges that are raised up by God. So that you note, Othniel is from Judah, Ehud is from Benjamin, Deborah from Ephraim, Barak from Naphtali, Gideon from Manasseh, Tola from Issachar, Jair and Jephthah from Gad, Ibzan we do not know, guess Judah, Zebulun for Elon, Abdon, Ephraim, Samson, Dan, and then we have Eli and Samuel from the tribe of Levi. And the very fact that we know their tribal background, that even though the author is speaking about the fact that Israel is delivered and Israel has peace, and so all Israel had peace, that we need to see that these judges were raised up at different times in different places within the land. And there's a very, very real possibility of the fact that we have overlap. Two passages in Judges certainly help us to appreciate that. In chapter 3, verse 31, we are told about Shamgar, one of those secondary judges. Speaking about Ehud, in verse 31, after him came Shamgar, the son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. So God used Shamgar, raised him up, and brought deliverance. Now, this is during a period where he has just said in verse 30, and the land was undisturbed for 80 years. Now, during that 80 years, right, the Philistines start to encroach, and Shamgar is raised up. Nothing is said about his judging, but he certainly brings a deliverance during this time of rest. And then interestingly, in 4:1, Shamgar doesn't fit into this basic chronology because the author goes back, and the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord after, not Shamgar, but after Ehud died. All right, so Shamgar is fitted in between Ehud and then the rising up of Deborah and Barak, which implies, again, the fact that, all right, there is some overlap that is taking place with these judges that are mentioned. And, of course, you go back and you note a little a little later on, as you get into Judges, that we have some of these other secondary judges, unlike Shamgar. And the notation is made not of their deliverance, but of how many years they judged Israel. And so we seem to see that, okay, these secondary judges are to be fitted in somewhat into the chronological scheme that the author is given as far as the primary judges are concerned. And then when you get to Judges, chapter 10, verse 7, we see in verse 6, we've had this before. This is part of the cycle. The sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, served the Baals, the Ashtaroth, etc. Verse 7, and the anger of Yahweh burned against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the Philistines and into the hands of the sons of Ammon. And they afflicted and crushed the sons of Israel that year. For 18 years they afflicted all the sons of Israel beyond the Jordan and Gilead in the land of the Amorites. And the sons of Ammon crossed the Jordan to fight also against Judah, Benjamin, and the house of Ephraim. Notice they just come to fight against these three tribes, and yet he says all Israel was greatly distressed. Right? The Ammonites are fighting against three tribes, but it is distressing all of Israel. But the important thing to notice is the anger of the Lord burned against Israel because, once again, of their idolatry, and sold them into the hands of both the Ammonites and the Philistines. And then the author moves toward concentrating upon the Ammonites that were distressing these three tribes. And so in response to that, God raises up Jephthah, and Jephthah deals with the Ammonites. It is later on when you get into the cycle concerning the judges. 13:1, the sons of Israel again did evil, that the Lord gave them in the hands of the Philistines 40 years. And now he seems to be going back to chapter 10, verse 7, saying, okay, I've told you about the 18 years with the Ammonites and what God did there. Now, Israel does evil, and God sells them into the hands into the Philistines 40 years, and there's a real possibility that that 40 years includes the 18 years that we've seen with Jephthah. And now he raises up Samson from the tribe of Dan. And 14:4 tells us that Samson was seeking or the Yahweh was seeking through Samson occasion against the Philistines, because at that time the Philistines were ruling over Israel. And once again, it might not have been all of the tribes, but the author speaks about the fact that this was the Philistines and their control, their dominion over Israel, from which Israel needed deliverance. So that it is usually assumed at this point, and we've already talked about the chronological marker of Judges 11:26, speaking of a date right around 1107 BC, 30 years after the conquest. And so that helps us to appreciate when Jephthah is being raised up, when this 18 years of Amorite oppression is going to come to an end. And then from 1107 BC, we can then fit in Jephthah's years of rest, and Samson is being raised up, and approximately 20 years after Jephthah fights the Ammonites, he will fight the Philistines, and this also in some way overlaps what is taking place in the central hill country with Eli and then Samuel. Now, one of the things we should note is that, all right, most evangelicals today, all evangelicals today, will assume the fact that the answer to the chronological knot is these overlapping judgeships. But then and you got three schemes you can look at just from the resources that I've given to you. You can take a look at Dr. MacArthur's chart on page 3, where he gives you the chart of where he thinks the judges come, and basically the earlier judges are one after another, and then toward the end they overlap, and he gives you a dating. You can take a look at the chart that is given to you in the discussion in Merrill's Kingdom of Priests, which is probably more where I would lean. Or you've got a chart with Walton as well. And I'm going to take the time. You can look at them and see when they get to the individual dates, they all right, within a decade, as we said, basically begin the period of the judges in the same point. All right, for Walton, he's going to begin in 1385 BC instead of 1375 BC. And take these years of overlap and try to bring them together using the best guesses from the biblical record and extra biblical records, and he will give you this basic estimated dates. And yet at the end of the chart he will note, and this is true of all of these men, and I'll try to give you the whole sentence here, and that is the chronology of the judges is very uncertain, because we are not told where the overlapping occurs. This, and you should underline, is one possible alignment. All right, so Walton has given you one possible alignment. Dr. MacArthur has given you a second possible alignment. And Dr. Merrill has given you a third possible alignment. And we might get to heaven and find out none of those alignments were exactly, were reflective of what happened. But remember what Walton said, this is one possible alignment. And there is no writer, no evangelical writer. We will all speak about the text is inerrant, but our reconstruction of the chronology of the text in the period of the judges is the place that is most suspect. And so the Bible is inerrant, but my chart isn't necessarily inerrant. My answer, therefore, to the liberals is, do you have the answer? And my answer is, no, I don't have the answer, but I have an answer. And an answer that I think fits in very, very well what we see as far as the Bible is concerned, because the Bible itself is implying the fact that we have overlapping of the judgeships. You just can't start with Othniel and come all the way to Samuel, add up the years and say, now, that was it. That one follows another. There are overlapping judgeships, and that is the solution. And then we have to read the text carefully, but at this point we just have to confess, like a number of places within the Old Testament, at this point we don't have sufficient data to give a once and for all, this is the answer. We are, again, within some broad framework. So, as I said, you've got three answers given to you within the resources that I have distributed for you to have you look at, and in the end you can take one of those three or go your own way. I would take one of the three. Going your own way is always very, very dangerous in the sense that you've got to spend a lot of original time and work and effort to go through and put together a chronological scheme. And I basically am satisfied that this is the answer, and as I said, where I would land is probably at this point closer to Dr. Merrill's final chart, and it's also reflective of what is in Leon Wood's survey of Israel's history as well. And I know what's the one that I was first exposed to, and so it makes greatest sense to me at this point, or whether I'm just convinced it is the simplest explanation of what we have within the biblical material. So I'm not concerned which scheme, in the end, but the fact that you understand where the answer lies as far as the chronological issue is concerned. Then one final debated issue, and I bring this up. There's a number of issues that we could talk about exegetically within the book of Judges. But I bring this one up to you because it's the most discussed within the commentaries. And I can tell you this, gentlemen, from pastoral ministry, it is the one that lay people find as well. They don't have to read the commentaries. All you have to do is challenge them to read the book of Judges, and I can tell you what the question will be next Sunday after they have read Judges. And that question is, what happened to Jephthah's daughter? And you say that's very, very interesting because scholars wrestle with that same question. Well, to show you how much this issue is discussed, Walton takes a whole page to give you the arguments for the two major positions that have been expounded. And really, we can put it this way, Jephthah's daughter, was she put to death? That is the question. Did she die or did she live? That is the question. Dedicated, you can put there, dedicated equals live. Sacrificed equals died. Now, ultimately, she died. Under both viewpoints. We're talking about what was Jephthah's response immediately to what had taken place. That is, did she die 2 months after his victory or years into the future? Did she die at the hand of Jephthah or a priest who was willing to accept the sacrifice? Because as you go back to Leviticus chapter 1, you have to remember a burnt offering. Remember who killed the person, the offerer. But then to be a burnt offering that was consumed and smoke. And of course you start talking about that and say, what priest would have taken a human corpse, having it drained of blood and put it on the altar as a offering to Yahweh? I mean, you can start to realize why, they'll bring up, the priesthood might have sunk low, but did it sink that low? I mean, you read about Eli's sons, would they have, when you talk about the depravity within the priesthood, would it go that far? And what about Jephthah? Jephthah's a judge. Jephthah shows up in Hebrews 11 as a man of faith. Would the Holy Spirit allow a God-ordained author to speak about Jephthah as a man of faith in the Old Testament hall of faith if he had actually killed his daughter as a burnt offering? So you can start to see that it's not as easy as it seems upon the surface. And of course, the writer of Judges never comes out explicitly and says, and she was sacrificed as a burnt offering. That he speaks in terms that, leaves it to the reader knowing and understanding Torah and what he has relayed about the period of the Judges to come and make the issue. Well, to me, gentlemen, you can go through all of the points, and sorry to say that, okay, he's got 7 arguments for the fact that she was dedicated as a lifelong virgin. that the bewailing and the fate that brings this kind of a response is the fact that she would never have a child, the greatest shame that a woman in Israel could have, versus the arguments for the fact that she was sacrificed. You can put all the other points within the text. I think, to my understanding, it revolves around verse 31. Here is Jephthah making the vow to Yahweh as he is going out to battle against the sons of Ammon. And he says, beginning in verse 30, if you will indeed give the sons of Ammon into my hand, then it shall be that whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the sons of Ammon, it shall be Yahweh's. And then you can see where the majority translators, when the original New American Standard was translated, or it will be Yahweh's, or I will offer it up as a burnt offering. So that the understanding of the conjunction in 1131 is understood on the dedication position as being rendered here, all right, whatever comes to meet me shall be the Lord's, or contrast, I will offer it up. That is, if it's a person dedicated to Yahweh. If an animal, then offered to the Lord. Now this understanding of the Hebrew, and you've heard me say this before, is possible. But it is not most probable within a narrative situation like this. And in fact, it is in number 6. The conjunction, says Walton, is better taken as one of apposition. That is, it will be the Lord's. That is, I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. It will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. In other words, he's showing how it is to be the Lord's. The burnt offering was an offering totally belonging to the Lord. The whole of the offering was consumed upon the altar. That's why sometimes it is known as the whole burnt offering. Now, obviously, if that's the way we are best to understand the grammatical construction here, if that is the most probable, and I would argue that it is the most probable, that would lead to the fact that we are not given an either-or in verse 31. We're given the fact she shall be the Lord's, or it shall be the Lord's. Whatever comes out of my house shall be the Lord's. That is, it will be the Lord's as I offer it up as a burnt offering. And I realize to that most probable understanding, there are all of the questions that are brought up. Then why does it say that, when Jephthah returns, the daughter comes out, he tore his clothes. Alas, my daughter, you brought me low. And you are among those who trouble me, for I have given my word to Yahweh. I cannot take it back. She says, my father, you've got to fulfill your word, since Yahweh is avenger of your enemies, the sons of Ammon. Just let me have 2 months to bewail my fate and weep because of my virginity, I and my companions. She did so. At the end of the 2 months she returned, verse 39, the father did according to the vow. So it goes back to verse 31. All right, the vow, what's his options there? And she had no relations with a man. Now those who take the dedicatory view, why is that brought up? Obviously, if she was slain, obviously she didn't have relationship with a man. So why is that there? And what is the custom in Israel that the daughters went yearly to commemorate? Does that mean to recount, to lament, to memorialize the daughter of Jephthah? What exactly is that? Well, it's the only place in Scripture that is mentioned as well. You can see the issues and why men recoil from the fact that this was the death of Jephthah's daughter. We see this in Wood's Distressing Days of the Judges, and this has been the view in 20th century evangelicalism. Wood expounds it as being the perpetual virginity and temple service of Jephthah's daughter. It was the view that I was taught in seminary. It was really the majority view a generation ago in evangelicalism. You can see, however, there has been a exegetical shift in contemporary evangelical circles, that the later works that have come out within the last 20 years or so have moved to the offering of Jephthah's daughter, her death, within this context position. Block, of course, is always very. One thing you'll like about Daniel Block, he never leaves you guessing on what his interpretation is, and he will bring up, if Hebrew grammar communicates anything, it communicates position B within this text. And Davis, a good Hebrew scholar, takes that position. And that's also an exposited Bible commentary, and the Bible Knowledge Commentary, probably the two most influential works within evangelical Christianity today. Both take this position. So obviously there is a movement to position B within evangelicalism today. And that, of course, kind of shows you my heritage, that I was told in seminary, certainly position A is the right position for the 7 reasons, among others, that are given in Walton's chart. But the more I have wrestled with Judges, the more I would see both with the grammar of verse 31 and with the flux and the flow as seen in Judges and Block's position, that if the book is showing, and whether it's the purpose or not, I do believe it is showing the Canaanization of Israelite culture, part of that Canaanization certainly would be what? A willingness to accept human sacrifice. So that I think within the flow of the book, so both what I would say is the best understanding of the Hebrew grammar of 1131 tied in with the immediate context of the book of Judges would lead me to take position B. Those who argue beyond that have to go back to Torah. Torah would never allow such a thing. And even as you get into the early chapters of Samuel, that as you see the depravity within the priesthood, the depravity within the people, the very fact when you get to 1 Samuel chapter 14, the people at that point would recoil from Saul putting to death his own son, gives you an indication the people would, even at that time as depraved as they were, would not have allowed such a thing to take place. Well, that's, all right, that's a broader context. And certainly we have to take into account the Torah spoke very strongly against any kind of human sacrifice, and certainly at a time of Saul's rebellion and the people being less than they should, and even the priesthood being less than it should, would it sink to that kind of allowance? That's a much broader framework. And then of course you got Hebrews 11, which is their clincher, who argue for position A against position B. It's not an easy issue. I guess I've become a little more dogmatic as the years have gone by toward B, but I would certainly not break fellowship with anybody who would take position A. We get the millennium, and I think Jephthah and his daughter, I think the daughter will be there. Jephthah, I think, will be there. And we can ask them, or we can actually run to the author of Judges and ask him. Or by then, we might not be so concerned about the whole issue anymore, because the whole issue has been resolved by resurrection. And all human sin is in the end resolved by resurrection. Ashley.
I was wondering, is it possible that Jephthah could have just offered her on his own without the priesthood?
It is possible. I would think there too it is unlikely. People bring up Jephthah's spotty background that the text brings up, but certainly the text is properly understood by the writer of Hebrews that no matter what his background, Jephthah does trust the Lord for victory, and yet he is a man of his times. He does exercise a level of brutality, but then we see within the book of Judges that's not unusual. So he is commended by his faith, not by every last thing that he did. Could a man of faith offered his virgin daughter? I would say, within the context of Judges and what it shows us about the time period there, yeah, I think that rationalization could have been made. Any priest. Now, it's true, we don't have Judges talking about a priesthood, but we certainly have in Judges 17 and Judges chapter 19, that certainly the Levites who aided the priests are not being viewed, by any stretch of the imagination as of models of spirituality and doing what the priest should do, which is to teach and model for Israel obedience to Torah. That is certainly not being seen within Judges, and I would also argue it's not seen within the early chapters of the book of Samuel in Eli's priests. Eli's sons who were priests, even though Eli's an interesting character. The text obviously, talks about his good points and his bad points, and his bad points certainly outweigh his good points as you read through that narrative. But certainly in his mentoring and his encouragement to Samuel, even though his own life and his own relationship with his sons has been less than it should have been, certainly he is brought as at least one whom God allows, Samuel, to be brought up within his house under his influence. And there is a level of godliness, within that. As Eli does point Samuel to Yahweh in 1 Samuel chapter 3, though not the first time. But ultimately we realize this is the Lord communicating to him and tells Samuel such. So Eli is brought before us as kind of a half-hearted follower of Yahweh who did not always have the strength of the positive conviction, but allowed things to take place that he shouldn't. But that's all tied into, the position on Jephthah. Did he have to go find a priest? Well, if he knew Torah well enough, and he certainly knew the events of the conquest, he was versed within Israel's history and Israel's traditions, then he would know that he would, from the Torah, have to involve a priest within a burnt offering. Did he go find a Canaanite priest? I'm not sure the text would allow us to go that far as Jephthah is concerned. So these are all questions, and I'll take a couple more questions, but my answer might be in the end, I don't know. But Chad and then Scott, then I'll talk about preaching judges, and we have to take a break.
You had said that those who would take position A would see Hebrews 11 as a clincher, but I was just thinking of David. Wouldn't that be a view of works righteousness, saying that no one who commit murder or such an evil act could get in contrast to their faith?
Yes, you can go down the whole list in Hebrews 11. And though, if position B is correct, no one in that list sunk quite as low as this. I mean, you take a look, every man there, has feet of clay. Abraham, Jacob, Moses, as you brought up David. Yeah, I wouldn't see, in my mind, Hebrews 11 is not a clincher. It is for them because how could someone do this kind of a depraved act and be recorded as a model of faith in Hebrews 11? And I think you brought up a good point in David. David was a Torah breaker as well. Committed high-handed murder following his adultery, and realizes by his own words in Psalm 51 that there was no sacrifice, there was no offering he could bring for what he had done. So if being a gross Torah breaker was enough to disqualify one from Hebrews 11, well, David should have been disqualified as well. All right, Scott.
I just was thinking, you kind of intimated that then we have some syncretism going on in the day of Jephthah, right? Because you got
the totality of the period of the judges, not just Jephthah.
So he makes a vow to Yahweh, but in practice he's following maybe a Canaanite influence of worship or whatever. Then on that basis,
syncretism. The Torah allowed vows. If you make a vow, fulfill it. Leviticus chapter 27. And beyond this, you can make a vow, but if you make the vow, you've got to fulfill the vow to Yahweh. So I don't think it's a matter of the vow, it's the nature of the vow. The fact that he would sink to the fact because the first thing out of the of my house could be person or could be animal. But if it was person, he probably wasn't thinking in terms of his daughter being the first one out. It could be a servant. And he might, canonization. In other words, it's not that he was revolted necessarily by human sacrifice as much as it's my daughter. I mean, any slave, if it had been the first one out, was a slave. I mean, slave's just part of my property anyway. So that kind of rationalization, yes, because of syncretism. So it's not the vow, although, Yahweh has said, I will give them into your hands. Why take a vow? I mean, Yahweh's already spoken. So we can kind of see this mishmash taking place within his mind. But then, others take vows. Gideon took a vow when he didn't need to take a vow. This is part of the synchronization that is taking place, where you got certain things within Torah. And because of the canonization, before we throw stones, we tend to do the same thing ourselves. Here's a principle of Scripture God wants me to obey. We live in this fallen culture. And how many of us and how many of the Christians to whom we minister will rationalize that what is taking place within culture is the way I am to interpret and understand how to fulfill this commandment that God has given to me. So the fact that the vow was not necessary here. The fact that he could give a vow, yes, part of Torah. But it's the nature of the vow that is probably showing a depreciation of human life, potentially, that shows him to be a man of his age.
I'm thinking also about with David, we have a little bit more of his life, and he's attested to as a man of faith. Because of the totality of his life, the one act wouldn't necessarily disqualify him from being in Hebrews 11. But with Jephthah, we have the one act, which is the vow, which which we're saying has some sort of syncretic influence on it. There's some canonization going on with that. So he's recorded for a vow that he makes that has the influence of a false religion in it. He's recorded as being faithful in that. I mean, that's an objection that I would see to that position.
Yeah, it is. And as I've brought up, I think it is a substantial opposition. It is not an easy exegetical decision. And certainly our discussion hopefully should say, don't just glibly say, this is what the text says, and if you can't accept it, well, your faith is suspect as well. And sometimes, but people on position B sometimes respond with that kind of an attitude toward those who espouse position A. David also was a man of his time. Well, you can start off with Abraham. I mean, you can go Abraham, Moses, the judges, and even David. David was a man of his time. The way he conducted warfare. You know what he did to the Ammonites at the end of chapter 12 of 2 Samuel. I mean, there's debate among evangelicals on whether that was going a little too far on the brutality that he showed to the Ammonites at that point. Certainly, it wasn't just the action that's recorded for us in 2 Samuel 11. You've also got his problems in 2 Samuel 23 and 24. That as you start to take a look in the appendix on some things about his life. I mean, the very last word about David in Samuel is in Samuel about David is he was a sinner. That he sinned in his taking of the census. Even Joab, who Samuel has shown has been no model of spirituality, understands, David, you're going beyond the boundaries. This is a census not for you objectively like Numbers 1 and 26 to find out how many men you have. This is, your motivation is to glory in how great your army is. Okay, you won all these victories. Why do you need to have the exact number? I'm the greatest king. I've got 1 million troops under my control right now. All right, you've gone beyond the boundaries. Well, that's the last word said by the author of Kings concerning David. It's not a very positive word. And yet, that's the same author who's introduced David to us in 1 Samuel chapter 13 by saying, now here's a man after my own heart who's going to replace you, Saul. So you're right that faith does not mean that, number one, a man is perfect, and a man, number two, is not influenced by what is taking place around him. That at times even his spirituality will be influenced by the nature of the culture in which he finds himself. And if that was true of David and the other great paradigm of faith within the Old Testament, Abraham, both of them, we can see it. Well, what about the judges? And we've already brought up that the judges themselves, I mean, they are the best of the worst. They're men that God's raised up that are certainly men of their times. And, and how far, God would allow an expression of less than Torah-like response in the part of a faithful man like Jephthah. I think on the paradigm of already Abraham and then David, probably a little bit more than probably we'd be comfortable with. But this all enters into the difficulty of making the decision. You can see how it becomes more than just a strictly exegetical decision. It really starts to enter into your, total understanding of who God is and to what extent God would allow something within the life of even a faithful man like Jephthah. And so obviously preaching Judges, wrestle with this passage before you preach it, because there is going to be one, what you're going to say. And I found that lay people don't like either view as possible. Take your pick. Let me just say, we can do that in an academic environment. Here's the pros, here's the cons. Take your pick. But if you do that in the message, I can tell you the whole congregation is going to come running up at you at the end of the service saying, "So what do you think? What is your conviction?" And I would just say this as far as preaching Judges. And I told you this, that Dan Block's commentary by his own preface is a labor of love. He was working on Judges before Broadman and Holman ever came to him as far as participating in the NAC series. He was already studying, preparing notes on Judges for his own students, because God had laid upon his conviction, the conviction upon his heart, that a book sorely lacking in being preached today, that needed to be preached within evangelical churches, was Judges. And so he prepared the commentary, not to prepare a commentary, but first and foremost to prepare preachers to preach Judges. And I would go along with, Dan Block. As difficult as Judges is to preach, it very much needs to be preached because, if I might put it this way, of the canonization of the American evangelical church. That evangelicals today, going back to Scott's question, are much more influenced by the culture than we wish to admit. And we express our spirituality much more in cultural rather than biblical ways than we are willing to face up to. And if there is a portion of the Word that will not only convey what took place historically in Israel, but then applying broadly the principle of 1 Corinthians 10, that these things happen as an example to us, then certainly, and I'm not as polished as Professor Montoya, I'm being able to say, now I'm talking to you. He's got an ability to do that I don't have. I'm more in the post-Professor Montoya era of being much more, here is the principle and let the Spirit of God apply it as he sees fit to you, to whom I am speaking. But how is a congregation going to be brought face to face with the secularization of their faith unless they're exposed to the portion of the Old Testament which most directly confronts that issue as it looks back at what took place during this era of Israel's history? Now, I'm not saying Judges is the first book you should preach in the church. I want to come in blazing my guns, you Canaanite evangelicals, you. As many times say, you begin as a chaplain, and you earn the respect of the people as pastor. Now, in God's eyes, you're pastor from the very beginning, under shepherd of that flock. But I think when your congregation knows that you have a concern for them, and you not tell them what they want to hear, but what they need to hear, that one of the things they need to hear is Judges. And so you be sensitive to the Lord. So this is not so much how to preach Judges, it is when to preach Judges. And when you have that relationship with your congregation, then preach Judges. and preach it first of all to yourself and then to the congregation. But be very sensitive, and as Bloch says, it's a book that needs to be heard again within contemporary American evangelicalism. So as hard as it is to read, as hard as it is to preach, it still is a very vital and important part of the Old Testament. Well, on we move to Samuel. That is the book of Samuel. And do recognize that the division is a later artificial division as far as the book is concerned. The writer did not finish 1 Samuel and say, you know, I really should do a sequel. This is a bad place to end the story with the death of Saul. I better tell people what happened. No, no, no. The original prophetic author penned as one book everything we read beginning in 1 Samuel 1 and going through 2 Samuel chapter 24. So no artificial division allowed when we study and interact with the book of Samuel. Just a few words of introduction. This is a place where the English follows the Hebrew, calling the book Samuel. The Septuagint, the Vulgate, calls this 1st and 2nd Kingdoms or 1st and 2nd Kings, with the book of Kings being 3rd and 4th Kingdoms or 3rd and 4th Kings. So within the Vulgate and the Septuagint, the Greek and the Latin tradition, they viewed Samuel to the end of Kings as being a literary whole that had been divided into four. Yet I think there are, as you take a look at the book, and you will see there is a much more detailed narrative taking place in Samuel. This could be the very nature of the material. It is only looking at 2 generations. It's looking as we're you're going to see, well, with Eli Samuel, it goes a little longer, but 2 generations of the monarchy. And in the end, we're only dealing with approximately 140 years of Israel's history. And of course, that's much different than the approximately 300 plus years, a little over 300 years that we see within the book of Judges. It's certainly going to be different than the more extensive history that again will go over 300 years that it will be seen in the book of Kings. Samuel is certainly slowing down once again the narrative time. More is going to be said about less in Samuel, and even so, we wish that the author of Samuel would say more than he says, but he says more, and so obviously you've got a much more detailed, a much greater depth of recording of historical events that takes place here than we had in Judges or we will have in Kings. It is much more like Joshua in that sense of relaying more about less. So I think the Hebrew tradition is well substantiated, and certainly is the way the text has come to us in the fact that there is a literary break between Samuel and Kings. That's all part of the story of the former prophets of Israel's 800 plus years within the land. But it is a distinct literary composition from the other parts of the former prophets. I've already stated for you the broad date of events. Obviously, this gets back into the chronological issue we just talked about in Judges. When exactly should we date the birth of Samuel? Well, in 8:1, it came about when Samuel was old. He appointed his sons to judge as judges over Israel. All right, an old man, a man who would come to the end of a priesthood, an active priesthood, would be 50 years of age, and a man would be viewed as becoming old somewhere within his 50s, when the hair turns from dark to white, when the beard goes from black to white, and when the man who is tall starts to stoop, and rather than a spring in his step, starting to need a walking stick to make it. Those were the kind of indicators, not so much you've turned a certain year, you're now old and can no longer be a judge. Samuel's about time for judges to die, so you're not quite dead but half dead, so you're old. All right, you no longer are able to keep up with the responsibilities of being a judge, so he appoints his two sons. And we'd assume that is somewhere between 50 to 60 years of age that he does that. And that then leads into the establishment of the kingship. And so that then helps us to appreciate if Saul's established right around 1050 BC. Then Samuel, if he's somewhere between 50 to 60 when that takes place, and probably a little closer to 60 by that point, he's appointed his sons. His sons have shown themselves to be evil judges, so that Israel calls for a king. All right, he is born somewhere between 1100 to 1110 BC, somewhere between 50 and 60 years previous to the record that is seen in 1 Samuel 8 and following. So we'll take around an 1110 BC date for Samuel. And of course, that would show some overlap, therefore, on the judgeship of Eli with Jephthah, and the judgeship of Samson with Samuel. To the last words of David that he utters just before his death, that are recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 23. That all right, if Samuel gets old, David does too. And David is going to die. And 23:1, these are the last words of David. And his last poetic words. And then when we get into Kings, we see that the last couple of years of David's life, he is senile, and whether he would speak words of poetry at that point, so I'm not going to go to the stake for the very last year of his life around 970 BC, but certainly within the last couple of years of his life, that's the last thing recorded, his last words. The last psalm, the last piece of poetry that is given to us from David within the text. This is it. This is the last words that David has communicated and spoken. So that this gives us some indication of the parameters of approximately 140 years that are communicated in this book. Now, the major themes, and I think it is important to note that as you go through Samuel, we are reintroduced to the priesthood, something that has not been emphasized in Judges. Oh, that's the end of that. All right, and the Ark of the Covenant. That's kind of the Essex wave there. It didn't quite come on the way I wanted it. But certainly these are areas that deal with, as we've talked about before, the cultic. What was taking place at the beginning of the book at Shiloh, where the tabernacle had come to be centered, where Eli will exercise his high priesthood, and even some more permanent structures, according to text, had been built around the tabernacle structure. What had been carried through the wilderness, brought in the land, had now at the end of the period of Judges become centered in Shiloh. And that's where the Ark of the Covenant was to be found. But as you get into the narrative of Samuel, not for long, because the Israelites came to believe that the ark represented the very presence of Yahweh. They had been defeated by the Philistines because they didn't have the presence of Yahweh. So bring the ark. You know, didn't the priests, carry the ark through the Jordan? Didn't they carry it around Jericho? Doesn't the ark have a role to play within Israel's battles by its physical presence? So bring the ark. And God shows what he thinks of the ark being used, as it were, as the magic box representing his presence. And some of you got the ark, you got the presence of Yahweh. There's no way we can lose. Well, yes, there is. That if there is not repentance, and if the battle is being fought in human strength rather than in faith in Yahweh, then the ark is taken. And the Lord allows the ark to be taken. And then we have the saga of the movement of the ark that is seen in Samuel. Even the very real possibility that is given to us, and there is textual debate about an ephod that is brought, or whether it is the ark that is brought in 1 Samuel 14:18, as Saul is fighting against the Philistines. Textual debate on that, but very possibly there was the ark as well in 14:18. Same issue. Let's guarantee our victory by making sure we have the physical presence of Yahweh. But ultimately, the ark, through David's response, is brought to Jerusalem, the place where now the central sanctuary in Kings is going to be built. So we have the priests, and we see under Eli the depravity of the high priesthood within his sons. We see Saul's response to the priests when they do not support him, when he views them as being antagonistic to them. He destroys them at Nob. And yet a priest is able to escape and has a protection from David, and ultimately it is David who will reconstitute and allow the Aaronic priesthood to take its rightful place within the national worship. And of course, we see within Samuel how Samuel shows the writer David being one who restores the proper heart toward the worship directed toward Yahweh through the priesthood, and the proper attitude toward the Ark of the Covenant. So that which had fallen into disuse, and that which had itself become depraved, no longer the model of what God wanted it to be, the priesthood, and the certain irresponsible use of the Ark of the Covenants that is changed by David is seen within the book. Also, in these to tie together as well. And that is, we see the prophets, God's spokesman, who bring the word of Yahweh to the people. And we have seen very little of prophetic ministry in the book of Judges. Now, one of the first things that Yahweh does as we come into Samuel with the last judge is raise up with Samuel a prophet. And with his ministry, we start to see those who also feel the call of the Lord, who associate themselves with Samuel, so that we have a group of prophets, and Samuel functioning as a prophet to Saul. And then as we get into the book, we see Gad and then Nathan functioning as prophets from Yahweh to the king. And it is very interesting here that, again, showing us the decline in the cultic, how God raises the prophets, who particularly in Samuel will become the spokesman for Yahweh to the new instruments of Yahweh that he will use within Samuel, and that is the ruler or the king. And if I can then kind of bring this up through the prophetic word, how Yahweh raises up the king, and through the prophet has Yahweh's sanction. And as particularly David will respond to the word of Yahweh, how then the Lord will use the king to confirm and reestablish the proper role of the previous cultic leaders, Yahweh's instruments, the priests, through meeting Yahweh at the Ark of the Covenant, how this is going to be reestablished. And so the very, very important role that prophets now start to take within Israel's life, their religious life, and a role that will only be expanded as we get into Kings. And then, of course, obviously, during the period of the Kings, we're going to see prophets who arise, whom God will lead to not only speak of the history of Israel, but also bring together the oracles that they spoke to Israel and Judah, and prepare us for what is going to be in the latter prophets. So here are the instruments of Yahweh, the reestablishment of the priesthood that takes place through Yahweh's raising up of prophets who speak to the final group that he raises up, the kings, and that in David following the prophetic word, how that then reestablishes, reconstitutes the priesthood and its proper role among the people. Now that, of course, then leads us to the king. And we find in Samuel, and this is the first place we see it within the Old Testaments, that we have read through the Torah, we have read through the first portion of the former prophets, and it is in Samuel that we see an association with this king, this leader whom God raises up and establishes with his authority, that is referred to as the Anointed One. Now, up until this point, God had the vessels of the tabernacle anointed. He had the high priest, as he was installed within his office in Leviticus 8 and 9, had been anointed. But now we see that this term used for priest and used for vessels, instruments of the tabernacle, is now taken and used for the one that God raises up as king. And we see this, and I'm not the first one to observe this, but at the very beginning and end of Samuel, how in two very similar poems as far as the themes are concerned, one Hannah's prayer and the other David's, that we see them both culminating and climaxing with anticipation of a coming king who is referred to as Yahweh's anointed. So that in 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 10, those who contend with Yahweh will be shattered. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. Yahweh will judge the ends of the earth. This is looking to Yahweh's final victory over his enemies, a victory that will extend to the very ends of the earth. And he will give strength to his king. And to say it a little different way, and will exalt, will lift up the horn, the power of his anointed one. And by poetic parallelism, the king, this future king who will win God's victories, is also referred to particularly as Yahweh's anointed one. And of course, this is the Hebrew term from which we get the term Messiah. And so it is here in Hannah's prayer where she relates this coming king that then goes back to Torah. The one who will be God's final victor is also God's anointed. When we come over to 2 Samuel chapter 22, I'll have you take a look at MacArthur's study Bible for all of the corresponding themes that are seen in these two poems, and the poem of David, where he speaks after the Lord delivered him from the hand of Saul, and he says in verse 51, Yahweh is a tower of deliverance to his king, and shows his loving kindness to his anointed one. To David, all right, that first anointed one who knew his loving kindness, and his seed forever. And so we'll get to this point. The kingship that's been established in David is also anticipating the final seed, the final king who will come. To David and his seed forever. And just as David was anointed, an anointed one, so will that final king who comes as well. And then he will speak about what God is going to do in the future in faithfulness to the promise that he had given to him in chapter 23, verses 1 to 7. And so these two poems also anticipate and look forward to this coming anointed one.